Okay, great. Well, it is my great pleasure to introduce Janet Franklin. I don't think, again, like Stephen, she doesn't need an introduction. Janet returned to us from Arizona. Very glad to know that. She's working now at UC Riverside as a, what is your position called now? Distinguished professor, probably, or something. Oh, in the Department of Botany. Janet works largely with respect to questions of sort of human-induced global change on plant communities at very, very large scales. So Janet's going to be talking about vulnerability of chaparral plant functional types.
Okay, thank you, Hugh, for the introduction. Thank you, Hugh and Nicole, for organizing this whole thing, and to all of you for inviting me to participate and present. So I am going to talk about a project looking at where we were using modeling to look at the vulnerability of chaparral plant functional types, or broadly to California's Mediterranean type climate functional types, to the triple threat of climate change, fire, and land use change. And this is work that I finished up a few years ago with my colleagues Helen Regan and Alexander Seifert, who probably many of you know, and we're sort of the triple threat as well, you know, against ignorance or something, I don't know. And I'd like to acknowledge our support from NSF and the Department of Energy. So when global change scientists talk about global change threats to our ecosystems, such as chaparral, those would include land use change, which removes habitat for species, human alteration of disturbance regimes. Ecosystems may be adapted to a particular regime of fire or flooding or hurricanes or whatever, but when humans alter, for example, fire frequency, that is an important global change agent. And then, of course, climate change. This map actually showing recent temperature changes, increases in warmer colors, as well as the dots are a bunch of studies that actually show a response of the physical or biological system to that, you know, already increasing Earth's temperatures due to anthropogenic global warming. And then there are, of course, interactions between these global change factors, fire disturbance, or in our case, fire disturbance, climate change, and land use change. As I understand it, the topic of the session that I'm now in is looking particularly at interactions between fire and climate change. I won't be addressing that directly or mechanistically in my talk, but I will sort of make use of it. All right, so land use change has historically been, you know, we all are very concerned for a good reason if you were here for the first session about climate change effects on ecosystems, but land use change has been historically the primary driver of biodiversity loss. And in the world's Mediterranean type ecosystems, including California, land use change includes land clearing for agriculture, but it's been going on for more than 10,000 years, for example, in the Mediterranean, which has a similar climate. But in Southern California, of course, we're mainly talking about urban growth. Ironically, in the Mediterranean basin, there's actually a land use change trend towards agricultural abandonment. So you actually get this kind of revegetation process happening in some places with feedbacks to fire disturbance. But we don't need to worry about that here. We can just sort of consider land use change equivalent to urbanization in Southern California, both in the urban core, spreading at the urban fringes, as well as sort of exurban development in Southern California. Here's an illustration of that from our work, just showing the change in the urban footprint in San Diego County from 1975 to 1999. And then borrowing, again, some slides from Alex Seifert, which she borrowed from Volker Radeloff, this national scale study of the wildland urban interface, maps housing density as a measure of urbanization for 2000, so recent history. And if you sort of keep your eye on Southern California, the red colors are, of course, the most are the most urbanized areas. And so these are the projections for 2030, which, by the way, is not that long from now, and showing projected increased urban growth in our region. Climate change projections, again, I sort of apologize. I'm using a little bit of an old example in terms of the climate model, but having just sat through the first session and where we're, actually seeing the effects of this hot drought, this climate change exacerbated drought on chaparral plants that California has experienced, these sort of simple pictures of warming don't actually seem so silly. So these maps are just showing the southwest Ica region of California. It's the area of western San Diego County and Riverside County and a little bit of and Orange and a little bit of LA County, which was we used as our study area. So you'll be seeing this blob, this shape of our landscape a lot. And on the left, you're seeing the temperature maps for January minimum temperature and July maximum temperature. Obviously, the warm colors are warmer, so don't worry about the absolute scale, but you can see the typical pattern that, the coastal areas are relatively warmer. The scales on the top and bottom are obviously not the same. The coastal areas are relatively warmer in the winter. The mountains are cool. This study area, ecoregion, is delimited on the east side by the crest of the Peninsula Ranges. Whereas the in July maximum temperatures are warmest in our interior valleys, and then these projections for end of century show it gets warmer as you go, from that way to that way on the slide, show pretty dramatic increases in temperature. And this particular, coming from a climate model, a general circulation model that's been downscaled. And this particular climate model and emission scenario was actually sort of a conservative one. So things may actually be warmer, are now expected to actually get warmer than that. So global warming shifts suitable habitat for species. The figure on the figure is illustrating a study that's actually recorded shifts in plant species uphill, basically for alpine plants in the Alps. And of course, now when we start looking at the interactions of this global change factor, if you have the climate changing and the places on the landscape that are climatically suitable for organisms, for plants and animals shifting uphill, higher latitudes, might be the main trends. The ability of organisms to track that can be affected by land use change. And so in this nice illustration of that a slide I borrowed from Helen Regan, if we can picture a distribution shift where the red dots are, the organisms shifting uphill unimpeded by land use change, and the gray dots are the organisms that died at the trailing edge, the warm edge of the distribution. If you now have land use change, then that effect of habitat loss and fragmentation can affect species' ability to respond in a resilient way to climate change. And of course, rare plants, they don't fly, and so they tend to, especially in our floristic province, they often have restricted distribution, so they can be highly susceptible to these changes. So Chaparral, don't need to tell any of you, in a Chaparral Symposium is adapted to a particular fire regime, is resilient to a particular fire regime, and that is a so-called low frequency, high intensity, stand replacing fire regime. So the plants that make up Chaparral and California's woodlands and other shrubland and woodland and shrubland vegetation have adaptations that either allow them, through succession or recovery to establish after fire, for example, from seed, or to resprout, as we heard about in the first session, from underground storage organs. And so the biggest documented effect of land use change on the fire regime, so the biggest sort of human effect on the fire regime in Southern California, is increased fire frequency due to increased ignitions, especially at the wildland urban interface. This increased fire frequency, and this is a map of urban in red, wildland urban interface in orange and yellow, and then wildlands in green, and the pink outlines are just a 25-year fire history showing the wildland fires sort of hugging that wildland urban interface. As I mentioned, fire frequency might also be affected by climate change. I'm not going to talk about that today. I think probably John Keeley and Max Moritz are going to talk about that tomorrow morning. So obviously this fires in Southern California shrublands have a big impact on the human communities here. But the purpose of our study was to look at the separate and combined, potential impacts of changing climate, changing fire regime, and changing land use on the plants that are typical of chaparral and woodland ecosystems in our region. So, and so I'm giving it the fancy name of fire response functional types, but I'm basically today going to be talking about the obligate cedars and obligate resprouters that Steve mentioned. So obligate cedars have fire stimulated germination. They are, for the most part, although we heard some exceptions to that, require fire to germinate. And the important thing is that they require an extended fire-free period in order to mature, set seed, and build up a seed bank. They also tend to be rather poor dispersers. I'll be talking about two case studies, Ceanothus variecosus and Ceanothus gregii. They tend to be sort of drop and roll seed dispersers, not so much carried by long distance by birds and things like that. And harvester ants don't move very far. If I have time, I might also mention another example from our work, which is Tacati cypress, but I don't imagine that I'm going to have time at the rate that I'm going. And then I'll contrast our projections for those obligate cedars with an obligate resprouter, and we're using Engelmann oak, a characteristic of Southern California, in fact an endemic oak with a fairly restricted range, and it resprouts following fire, but it also disperses and establishes between fire and being dispersed by birds and mammals and things like that. It has a longer potential dispersal distance, a greater ability to disperse, which might lead us to predict or ask, will it be more resilient to these effects of land use change, climate change, and altered fire regime? So we used computer simulation modeling of various types to predict the separate and combined impacts of urban growth, climate change, and altered fire regimes on these two key plant functional types. I've already described the two fire responses, but also these species varied in their geographical distribution. So what is also the effect of whether a species is very rare, range restricted versus widespread, and where that distribution is in terms of current and projected land use change or urban growth. So this is this kind of awful cartoon that I've been living with for a long time because I made it, that schematically shows what we're trying to do. The outlines, these patches, are suitable habitat for our species, say a butterfly, but of course we're only interested in plants today, those at time 1. So those are patches where the species occurs under the current climate. We then might project, based on climate matching, that at time 2, the distribution of suitable habitat for that species is going to be these this solid or hatched polygons. Whoops. So the most sort of pessimistic view of what's going to happen to this species, which might be to say how much overlap is there between them, and that's area A. There's not very much overlap, but species, organisms do have some ability to disperse. So given the traits of the species and their ability to disperse, sorry, this is very sensitive and I'm not used to max, but also given our predictions about how urbanization and fire, say an altered fire regime, might affect the location, size, and quality of those habitat patches. You know, what are our projections about how all those factors might affect a chaparral plant that we're interested in? So we do this by coupling species distribution models, urban growth models, and population models. And I'll show you brief examples, but essentially by taking species locations and climate maps and looking at the correlation and then also overlaying urban growth, we could come up with a map of the, say, suitability of habitat for a particular species, and then by projecting that model onto future climate maps, we could predict the future suitability of habitat and availability based on land use for that particular species. But of course, that doesn't take into account anything except climate correlations and urban growth projections. And so then what my clever colleagues would do is take that map and sort of abstract it into a network of patches where the focal species occur. So they're using metapopulation models to characterize that sort of abstract habitat suitability map into a bunch of patches that a network of patches that have a certain carrying capacity and linkages between them based on their distance. And then the population model takes into account the life history traits and demographic traits of the population. So, you know, how many seeds it produces, what the longevity of the species is, and then what its fire tolerance or fire response is. And we essentially incorporate changing fire regime as simply as different scenarios, you know, more fire, less fire in the population models, the simulation models. So an example of species distribution modeling is you have a bunch of locations in the landscape where you know if the species you're interested in is present or absent. So again, overlaying that on a bunch of maps of not only climate, but other factors that are expected to control the distribution of that species, things related to topography, for example, or soils. We can come up with some type of a model of habitat suitability and then project that model on, apply the same model to future climate maps based on climate models. Like the ones that Alex mentioned that the other Alex is doing. So the top row are examples for Ceanothus gregii, and even though the color scales are different, warmer colors again is more suitable habitat. On the left are the suitability under current climate, and then the middle and the right are suitability under future climate with 2 different climate change scenarios. So it shows the range of uncertainty, for example, in the based on the different models of climate change. You can see in the top row for Ceanothus gregii, there's little white dots, and those are the current distribution of those are the data that were used to develop the model, illustrating its current distribution, which is sort of useful because it shows that this is an example of a species that's sort of a foothills montane species that in sort of that classic way, climatically suitable habitats getting squeezed off the top of the mountains, the peninsular ranges in this case. And in the interest of time, I'll keep moving. Then our projections for urban growth came from actually what looks like a fairly conservative projection done by a number of years ago, almost a decade ago now, by Alexandra Seifert and her colleagues. So yellow is the urban extent of San Diego County at the year 2000, and red and green, which you can barely see, as projected urban growth by 2050. And as we illustrated earlier, some of the national and state level projections are actually more even more extensive than this, based on population projections and so forth. So we put those things together. Again, we, from those two things, we can get at suitable habitat from a map of the current distribution of the focal species. We can say which of those suitable habitats are also occupied, and then we can change that suitability map through time and again abstract it into a network of subpopulations and run a metapopulation model that actually accounts for things like the species' ability to disperse and its demographic response to fire. So, instead of just this sort of map shifting, we get something that's actually much less interesting to look at and maybe a little bit confusing, but I'll just show you a few results. Okay, so for Ceanothus gregii, our obligate seeding chaparral shrub that occurs in the foothills and mountains, it occurs in areas that are not currently urbanized, and in our study area, we did not project much urbanization in those areas. So it's not very affected in our models by urbanization at all. So the graphs I'm going to show you have fire return interval in increments of decades across the y-axis, and you can think of the x-axis as like a population index or a population estimate. It's sort of it's actually in population numbers, but don't think of it in terms of real numbers so much as relative numbers under different scenarios. The different dots, each dot represents a combination of climate change or current climate, urban growth or no urban growth, those things. So, and each of those dots actually represents like 1,000 population simulations. So it's an average, which accounts for stochasticity, but the variance is actually not very big. So, so in this case, if I can get the mouse to work, the highest population estimates are under status quo, meaning current climate, at fire return intervals of sort of 30, 40 years. So, fire return interval has a big effect on these obligate seeders, but they're also, we assume them to be sort of short-lived, so we also see an effect of declining population at longer fire return intervals, but we see a huge effect of declining population, in fact, virtually to zero, under extremely high fire frequency. Down, if we use an average fire return interval of 10 years, basically the population goes to zero with no climate change and no urban growth. In these scenarios, you can't even tell the symbols apart between no urban growth and urban growth because there's no effect on this particular species projected in our models. Whereas the lower lines on the graph are, the lower sets of dots are estimated population under climate change. So that predicted loss of habitat under climate change has a very big effect on the population, but even more immediately, these very short fire return intervals are due. We can contrast that with another Ceanothus that has a very restricted coastal distribution, Ceanothus variecosus. It's the blue patches in these maps. This is from Don Lawson's PhD thesis. And it basically occurs just in little patches within urban San Diego is the only place that it persists. So gray is urban, green are natural habitats, and you can ignore the rest of the symbols, but they were from other species that she studied. So very rare, very range restricted coastal surrounded by urbanization. In this case, we see a similar pattern where with no habitat change, no climate change, the highest estimated population sizes are at these moderate fire return intervals, but really there's not much of a effective fire return interval, negative effect unless you go to very short fire return intervals. I'm showing one climate change projection here. The squares say that under this projected climate change, you also lose habitat and the population declines. Also, urbanization is projected to cause population decline. Not necessarily because you're building on top of where it is, but you're building on top of where it could be. Those combined effects, urbanization and climate change, are basically additive. So the solid diamonds are both effects. So what if we try to include a management response in our forecasts? So in this case, you can barely see a difference, but we've tried to add urban reserves. So try to add some more protected area, hopefully in the places where the species could persist under climate change. So now the circles, the circles and the diamonds include reserves. Well, I guess we didn't put our reserves in the right place, or enough of them, or there's just no place to put them, because it did not make a huge difference in this case, but it's the kind of thing that we could look at. And then he's standing up, so I think I'm almost done here. We can contrast that with an obligate resprouter, where the top versus bottom graph, if you look at the numbers on the side, now I'm separating them. The top is no climate change, the bottom is climate change. We again predict a tenfold decrease in habitat area due to climate change, and also in population. But in this case, the higher populations projected you still see a somewhat of a negative effect of high fire frequency, even for an obligate resprouter, although the population doesn't go to zero. But the open circles here are, the difference in the symbols here are different assumptions about dispersal ability. So in this case, the circles that have the highest population estimates, we're assuming the greatest dispersal distance possible for Engelmann oak. And in this case, the separation between those lines, between population estimates as a function of dispersal distance, is greater in the bottom graph. It's greater under climate change. In other words, greater dispersal ability buffers the impacts of habitat loss due to climate change. And I don't have time to go over that. So while we do project these large climate change impacts because of shifts in suitable habitat and its inaccessibility and poor dispersal, you have to remember that's just based on correlations. Urban growth also has an impact, and too frequent fire has a very extreme impact on obligate cedars, but also obligate resprouters. And so increased fire is a very immediate and profound threat, maybe even more immediate than climate change for these plant functional types. And by modeling multiple threats, this allows us to look at things like ranking priorities in terms of management response. By looking at the effect of climate change, well, how do you mitigate that? We try to mitigate, emission of greenhouse gases. That's maybe not a regional management issue. It's kind of global. In terms of the effect of fire frequency, that could be best addressed through fire management. Again, not trivial in our landscape. And on the other hand, the effects of urbanization, the response might be in terms of land use planning. And then I threw in there for good measure this idea of assisted migration or translocation of species to sort of help them along through these multiple threats. Thank you.